A smug professor thought he'd crush faith with a single lecture, targeting Barron Trump in front of a packed hall, until the young Trump turned the tables and left him speechless. What started as a mockery of God became a showdown that shattered an academic titan, and you'll never guess how it ends. Before we get into the details, let me know in the comments where you are watching this video from. Imagine this: a packed lecture hall, tension crackling in the air, and a smug professor about to get the shock of his life. Welcome to a day that would go down in history, starring none other than Barron Trump. Curious where this epic clash unfolds? Stick around. You won't believe how it ends. It all happened at a top-tier academic summit, the kind where America's sharpest young minds gather to flex their brainpower. Think Ivy League vibes, polished with podiums, and professors who love to strut their stuff. Barron Trump was there, a tall figure in the crowd, invited for his standout intellect, though some whispered it was just his famous last name that got him in. At 19, he carried himself with a quiet confidence that didn't need to shout. Across the room stood Professor Robert Ellison, a legend in academic circles for his razor-sharp mind and even sharper sarcasm. This guy wasn't just a teacher. He was a performer, turning lectures into showdowns where old-school values, especially faith, got roasted on the spot. Ellison's reputation? Infamous. His classes were like intellectual cage fights. Students loved the drama, even if they squirmed at his jabs. That morning, as the grand forum buzzed with anticipation, no one knew they were about to witness a battle for the ages. Picture this. Ellison kicked off, strutting across the stage like a lion eyeing its next meal. His topic? Ditching dusty old beliefs for shiny new reason. Time to leave the fairy tales behind, folks. His gaze swept the room and snagged on Barron, a flicker of a smirk tugging at his lips. Big mistake. He had no clue he'd just lit the fuse on the most humbling moment of his career. Let's cut to the chase, Ellison boomed, arms crossed like he owned the place. Science says it loud and clear. The smarter you get, the less you buy into myths about some cosmic puppeteer. He flashed a chart on the screen, jagged lines plunging downward. See this? Faith tanks as brains grow.
Cool, right?
A few students shifted in their seats, sensing the jab aimed at Barron. Guess some folks, Ellison added with a pointed glance, are too tied to family traditions to keep up with the rest of us. Near the back, Professor Thomas Hayes watched, brow furrowing. He'd seen Ellison push buttons before, but this was personal, and it was about to blow up in his face. Ellison leaned into it, voice dripping with swagger. Here we are, surrounded by America's future, scientists, CEOs, big thinkers. And yet, I'd bet some of you still cling to those cute little bedtime stories about a man in the sky. Says a lot about your brain power, doesn't it? He zeroed in on Barron again, daring him to bite. Most students ducked their heads or forced awkward chuckles, but not Barron. He sat still as stone, meeting Ellison's stare with cool, unflinching calm. That only stoked the professor's fire. Come on, he taunted, leaning on his podium like a boxer mid-fight. It's 2025. Tell me, what kind of mind still buys into an invisible sky boss when we've got AI and quantum tech explaining it all? Anyone want to take a crack at that? His eyes locked on Barron. Maybe our VIP guest has some wisdom to share? The room went dead silent. You could hear a pin drop as every head turned, waiting for the next move. And then boom, Barron stood. Actually, Professor, his voice sliced through the hush, steady as steel. I'd love to shed some light on that for you. Ellison's smirk widened, thinking he'd hooked an easy target. Oh, fantastic. Young Mr. Trump's here to school us all. Go ahead, tell us how your big guy upstairs fits into a world of hard science. Barron didn't flinch. Here's the thing, he started calm but firm. I find it odd that a guy so big on open debate would rather sling insults than dig into real discussion. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Ellison's grin twitched, just a hair, but he waved it off. Please spare me the sermon, he snapped. I've got decades of research under my belt. You think you know better? I'm not here to preach, Barron shot back, his tone gaining edge. I'm saying your bias is showing, Professor. You tout evidence, But you dodge the fact that some of history's sharpest minds, like Newton or Mendel, saw no clash between faith and reason. Ellison scoffed. Old news. What's next? God's got a campaign hat too. The cheap laugh flopped. Barron didn't blink. Here's what's wild. Barron pressed on, standing taller. You mock faith, but you're the one acting like a preacher, pushing your own gospel of, I'm smarter than you. That's not science, that's ego. The room froze. Even Professor Hayes sat up straighter, watching Ellison's smug mass crack. This wasn't just a debate anymore, it was a reckoning. Ellison snarled. All right, hotshot, you want a real fight? Step up here and prove your ancient myths hold water. As Barron started toward the stage, the air buzzed with electric anticipation. No one, not even Ellison, saw what was coming. Barron Trump, all 19 years of him, stepping onto a stage that's suddenly a battlefield, facing down a professor who's spent decades sharpening his wit like a blade. The grand forum's air hums with tension. Students lean forward, eyes wide, as if they're watching a title fight. Professor Robert Ellison, still smirking, thinks he's got this in the bag. Spoiler alert, he's dead wrong. Curious how a kid half his age flips the script? Hang tight, this is where it gets wild. Barron reached the podium, tall and steady, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife. Since you brought up quantum physics, Professor, he began, clear and unshaken. Let's dive in. You say faith and science can't coexist, but quantum mechanics itself proves reality's weirder than your charts let on. Ellison rolled his eyes, cutting in with a scoff. Oh, please, don't twist science into some mystical mumbo-jumbo to prop up your fairy tales. I'm not twisting anything, Barron replied, cool as ever. I'm pointing out what you dodge. Even your precious science hints at something bigger. Take the universe's fine-tuning, constants so precise that life's existence is 1,000,000,000,000 to one shot. You call that random? Ellison's smirk faltered, just for a split second, but the crowd caught it. A murmur rippled through the seats. This wasn't the pushover he'd expected. The professor recovered fast, leaning forward with a sneer.
Fine tuning?
That's just gaps in our knowledge. Gaps we'll fill without your sky boss stepping in. Barron didn't miss a beat. Gaps, huh? Funny how you're so sure those gaps prove you right. Sounds like faith to me, just dressed up in a lab coat. A few students gasped, others nodded. Professor Thomas Hayes, watching from the back, scribbled a note, his frown deepening. This was no ordinary debate. Ellison gripped the podium, his voice rising. Faith? Ideal in facts, kid, 30 years of them. You're out of your league. Barron tilted his head, unfazed. Facts are great, Professor. Let's talk some. You lean on IQ stats to dunk on faith, but what about the studies showing believers often outpace skeptics in resilience and mental health? Correlation's not causation, sure, but you didn't mind implying it when it suited you. The room buzzed. Ellison's face twitched, a crack in his armor showing. Resilience. Ellison barked, trying to claw back control. That's just clinging to a crutch, because you can't handle reality. Barron's eyes narrowed slightly, his tone sharpening. Or maybe it's you clinging to a crutch, your title, your podium, your smug little jabs. Who's really scared of reality here? The crowd erupted in whispers. A girl in the third row dropped her pen, too stunned to pick it up. Ellison's knuckles whitened on the podium. He fired back, voice dripping with venom. You think you can waltz up here and lecture me? I've forgotten more about cognitive science than you'll ever know. Barron didn't flinch. Then why can't you answer me, Professor? If faith is so weak, why's it got you rattled? Why's a myth making you sweat? The silence hit like a thunderclap. Even the projector's hum seemed to hold its breath. Ellison's eyes darted, searching for an escape. I'm not rattled, he snapped too loud. You're just spouting nonsense. Consciousness, fine-tuning, it's all explainable. Barron stepped closer, voice steady as steel. Is it? Explain consciousness, then. Tell us how lifeless matter dreams up thoughts. Tell us why the universe's math lines up just right for us to exist. Go ahead, I'll wait. The professor's mouth opened, then shut. The crowd leaned in, hooked. You're dodging the point. Ellison sputtered, red creeping up his neck. Science doesn't need your God to figure it out. Barron's gaze locked on him, unrelenting. Then why's your science sounding more like a sermon? You're not explaining, you're preaching. You've got your own dogma. I'm right and you're dumb. That's not reason, that's arrogance. A lone clap broke the stillness, then another. Ellison's head whipped toward the sound, disbelief etched on his face. Professor Hayes stood now, arms crossed, watching his colleague unravel. Ellison tried to rally. This isn't a theology class, Mr. Trump. Save it for Sunday. But Barron wasn't done. You made it personal, Professor. You mocked billions, scientists, thinkers, everyday folks, who see no war between faith and reason. You're not mad at God. You're mad someone dares challenge your throne. The room was electric, every word a spark. Ellison's voice cracked as he lunged for a comeback. You're twisting everything. I've got evidence, decades of it. Barron cut in, calm but lethal. Evidence you cherry-pick. You ignore Newton's faith, Mendel's prayers, even modern minds like Francis Collins.
Why?
Because they don't fit your story. Who's the one scared of truth here? The professor froze, mouth agape, as the crowd's whispers swelled into a roar. And then, bam, Barron dropped the hammer. Here's the kicker, Professor. You say faith's irrational, but you believe order sprang from chaos, life from nothing, all without a push. Which takes more faith, God, or your everything from nothing magic trick? Ellison's face drained of color. The room held its breath, waiting for his next move. Spoiler, it's not what you think. This clash is far from over, and the fallout's gonna blow your mind. A lecture hall turned silent arena, where a young man's words had just toppled a giant. Barron Trump, all 19 years of him, stepped back from the grand forum stage, leaving Professor Robert Ellison a shadow of his former self, papers strewn, hands trembling, pride in tatters. Think this showdown's over? Not quite. The real fallout's about to hit, and it's a twist no one saw coming, not even Barron. Buckle up, this is where the story takes a turn you'll never forget. The room still buzzed as Barron returned to his seat, his calm stride a stark contrast to Ellison's unraveling. Students whispered furiously, stealing glances at the young Trump, their eyes wide with something new, respect. Professor Thomas Hayes lingered near the front, his intervention having paused the carnage, but the damage was done. Ellison stood frozen behind his podium, staring at the scattered notes of a lecture he'd never finish. His voice, once a booming force, had shrunk to a shaky murmur as he tried to restart. Modern rationality, he mumbled, but the words fell flat, drowned by the crowd's restless hum. He shuffled his papers, hands jerking like a puppet with cut strings. Every glance darted toward Barron, as if expecting another blow. The students weren't listening anymore. Some scribbled notes, not about the lecture, but about the clash they'd just witnessed. A guy in the back muttered, "Did you see him take Ellison apart?" A girl nodded. "Never seen anyone do that. Not like that." The professor flinched at a raised hand, bracing for another attack, but it was just a question about the slides. He stumbled through an answer, his authority leaking away with every word. For the next half hour, Ellison limped through his talk, but the room's focus stayed on Barron. The young man sat composed, jotting notes with that same steady hand, as if he hadn't just dismantled decades of smug certainty. Ellison's eyes kept flicking to him, each look a mix of dread and disbelief. The slides, once his weapons, now mocked him. Rational thinking today. The irony stung, and the crowd felt it too. A few stifled chuckles broke the tension, but most just watched, replaying Barron's final strike. Which takes more faith, God, or your nothing made everything trick? As the session ended, the usual rustle of bags came with a buzz of excitement. Dismissed, Ellison croaked, his signature bravado reduced to a whisper. Students clustered, voices overlapping. He didn't even blink, one said. Ellison's done cooked, another laughed. A small group lingered by the door, once fans of the professor's sharp jabs, now shifting awkwardly as their idol shrank behind his podium. The man who'd ruled this hall for years looked small, smaller than anyone thought possible. Barron packed his things, unfazed by the stares. "Hey, Barron," a voice called as he headed out. A lanky student with glasses jogged up. "That was unreal. Man, like next level." Others chimed in, a few clapping. "You shredded him." Barron gave a modest nod. "Thanks, just sharing what I think," he said, brushing off the praise. His humility only fueled the awe. Here was a guy who'd humbled a titan and didn't need to gloat. Professor Hayes approached Ellison, who still hadn't moved. "Robert," he said softly, resting a hand on the podium. "Maybe this is a chance to rethink some things." Ellison's gaze drifted to Barron's empty seat, now a silent taunt to his shattered worldview. He nodded faintly, lips tight. The hall emptied, but Ellison stayed, alone with his notes. 30 years of mocking faith reduced to a pile of crumpled paper. His hands traced the edges, as if searching for the confidence he'd lost. Then, a shadow fell across the desk. "Professor?" It was Barron, pausing before leaving. Ellison looked up, his old arrogance gone, replaced by something raw, respect, maybe even fear. "You know," Ellison said, voice low, "in all my time teaching, no one's ever turned my own logic against me like that." Barron offered a small smile. "Sometimes the best case for faith comes from the ones who try to tear it down." Ellison blinked, the words sinking in. "Maybe," he murmured, "the real closed minds aren't the believers. It's the ones who think they've got it all figured out." He paused, then added, "Like me." The admission hung heavy, a crack in the armor he'd worn for decades. Barron nodded. "Takes guts to see that, Professor. Good luck with the rest of the summit." With that, he walked out, leaving Ellison to wrestle with a truth he'd never faced. Word of the clash spread like wildfire through the conference. By afternoon, whispers turned to shouts. Students, professors, even staff, replaying the moment Barron flipped the script. "He took Ellison apart with facts," one said. "Faith and brains? Who knew?" Another laughed. The story grew legs, racing beyond the hall to campuses nationwide. A grainy video popped up online. Barron's steady voice, Ellison stammers, and it went viral, racking up views from Boston to Boise. Ellison didn't speak much that day. He sat through the closing talks, eyes distant, replaying Barron's words. His next lecture? Quieter, less biting. Students noticed. He skipped the usual jabs, sticking to the material. Some said he'd lost his edge. Others saw a man rethinking his game. Professor Hayes kept an eye on him, hopeful. "He'll bounce back," he told a colleague, "but he won't forget this." Barron, meanwhile, stayed low-key, dodging the spotlight as the tale took off. At the summit's end, a girl stopped him. "You changed how I see this stuff, faith, science, all of it," she said. Barron shrugged. "Just glad it made you think." That day etched itself into academic lore, not just as Barron Trump's stand, but as proof that truth, wielded right, can shake even the toughest foundations. Word of the showdown spread beyond the Grand Forum's walls, igniting conversations across campuses from coast to coast. Barron Trump's stand wasn't just a fleeting moment. It became a spark, a story whispered in dorms and debated in classrooms. A shaky video of the clash surfaced online, capturing his calm resolve against Professor Ellison's stammers, and it raced through screens everywhere, from New York to Nevada. People watched, rewatched, and argued. Was this a win for faith, for reason, or both? Ellison retreated into silence, his once loud lectures now subdued, while Barron walked away unchanged, a quiet force who'd shifted the ground beneath them all. It wasn't just a debate. It was a reckoning that echoed far beyond that day, proving one thing. When conviction meets arrogance, the truth doesn't bend. A once mighty professor, alone in a dim lecture hall, his notes a crumpled testament to a battle he never saw coming. Barron Trump, the 19-year-old who'd turned the Grand Forum into a proving ground, had walked away victorious, not with fists, but with words that cut deeper than steel. Think the story ends with Ellison's defeat? Not quite. The real legacy begins now, and it's a ripple that'll shake minds far beyond that day. Stay with this. It's a finale that hits hard and lingers long. After the clash, the hall emptied, but Professor Robert Ellison stayed rooted, staring at the chaos of his papers. The man who'd spent 30 years mocking faith now sat silent, replaying Barron's parting words. Sometimes the strongest arguments for faith come from those who try to destroy it. His hands traced the edges of his notes, once weapons of scorn, now relics of a shattered creed. Outside, the summit hummed on, but inside, Ellison wrestled with a ghost he'd dismissed for decades, doubt in his own certainty. Barron, meanwhile, slipped through the crowd with his usual quiet grace. Students swarmed him near the exit, voices overlapping. "That was unreal, man," a curly-haired guy exclaimed. "You flipped the whole game," a girl added, eyes bright. Barron nodded, his smile small but genuine. "Just spoke what I know," he said, brushing off the hero worship. His humility only sharpened the contrast. Where Ellison had crumbled, Barron stood taller, not by arrogance, but by conviction. Word of the showdown didn't stay contained. By dusk, it raced through the conference, like a spark on dry grass. "Did you hear? Trump's kid took Ellison down," one professor muttered over coffee. "With logic, not lineage," another corrected, grinning. A shaky phone video hit the web, an undergrad's blurry capture of Barron's steady voice dismantling Ellison's stammers. Views climbed fast, from Philly to Phoenix, as forums lit up with debates. "Faith's got brains too," one post read. "Ellison's toast," another crowed. Back in the hall, Ellison finally rose, gathering his things with shaky hands. Professor Thomas Hayes found him there, shadows stretching across the room. "Rough day, Robert," Hayes said, voice gentle but firm. "Maybe it's a chance to recalibrate." Ellison's eyes flicked to Barron's empty seat, still a silent jab at his old bravado. "He didn't just challenge me," Ellison murmured. "He exposed me." Hayes nodded. "Takes guts to see it. Bigger guts to change." The next morning, Ellison's lecture was a shadow of its past self. No jabs at Sky Daddies, no smug charts, just dry facts, delivered in a voice that barely carried. Students noticed, some smirked, others pitted. "He's spooked," a guy whispered. "Barron broke him," his friend replied. Ellison caught their glances, his old fire snuffed out. Later, he sat in his office, staring at a photo of himself grinning at a podium years back. That man felt like a stranger now. Across campus, Barron joined a panel on science and ethics, his presence drawing a packed room. He spoke simply, faith and reason as partners, not foes, citing minds like Newton and modern pioneers like Collins. The crowd leaned in, scribbling notes, a far cry from Ellison's fading echo. "He's not just some name," a grad student muttered. "Guy's got depth." Another nodded. "Makes you rethink everything." The video kept spreading, hitting dorms and diners nationwide. In a Chicago bar, students replayed it, cheering Barron's "Nothing Made Everything" zinger. In a Texas library, a study group paused to watch, one saying, "Faith's not dumb, it's tough." Even skeptics grudgingly nodded. Barron's calm logic was hard to dismiss. Online, it racked up millions of views, tagged "Trump versus Prof" or "Faith Fights Back." It wasn't just a moment, it was a movement. Ellison didn't vanish, he adapted. Weeks later, his lectures softened, probing questions replacing sneers. "What do we really know about consciousness?" he asked one day, no smirk in sight. Students blinked, some called it growth, others weakness. Hayes saw it differently. "He's not the same," he told a colleague, "but he's thinking again." Ellison even penned a quiet paper, rethinking certainties, citing gaps he'd once mocked. It wasn't a conversion, just a crack in the wall. Barron? He stayed Barron, low-key, focused, dodging fame. At the summit's close, a shy freshman stopped him. "You made me see faith isn't stupid," she said. "It's strong." He shrugged. "It's just truth holding its ground." That truth echoed on, etched into academic lore as the day a young man faced a titan and won, not with noise, but with a steady voice that wouldn't bend. Ellison's old taunts faded. Barron's stand endured. Later, they'd still talk about it, a clash that proved faith and intellect aren't rivals, but allies in the hunt for what's real. From lecture halls to living rooms, it lingered as a reminder. When arrogance meets conviction, truth doesn't just win, it reshapes the battlefield.